All right, let's jump right into today's explainer. We are doing a full exam review session covering the massive nation-altering changes that swept through the United States from 1800 to 1865. We're going to visually map out a wildly turbulent era in history, a period where the country experienced explosive geographical expansion and a huge surge in national pride, but at the exact same time found itself hurtling straight toward the most devastating conflict in its history. So if you're studying up for your exam, you are in the exact right place. Let's get into it. So here's the big, essential question we're tackling today. It's the core of everything we'll cover. We're going to trace how every single new piece of land added to the map basically acted like a ticking time bomb for the nation. Because you see, it wasn't just about gaining territory. It was about the intense, completely unavoidable arguments over exactly what kind of society was going to exist on that new land. Here's our study guide roadmap for today. We've got the era of expansion, defining the sectional divide, failed compromises and crises, a timeline to war, and finally, the Civil War erupts. Let's get right to it. Section 1, the era of expansion. Let's lay the groundwork for how the country grew both in its physical size and in its own identity. You know, back in the early 1800s, the United States fought the War of 1812 against Great Britain. And even though the British famously burned down the White House, there wasn't really a clear winner on paper. But despite that, Americans felt this immense sense of success. This defensive victory really brought everyday Americans together with a shared national pride, which is nationalism. This newfound confidence was actually so strong, it led to the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, which was this really bold policy effectively telling European countries, hey, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Right alongside that swelling national pride, the market revolution was completely shaking up everyday life. The economy shifted dramatically, all thanks to new inventions and much faster transportation. We're talking networks of canals, steamboats, and railroads suddenly connecting very distant parts of this growing nation, letting goods and people move incredibly fast. But we have to remember, this economic boom had a really dark consequence. It vastly increased the demand for enslaved labor, particularly down in the South, to grow cash crops like cotton for this booming new market. And just look at the sheer scale of this expansion. It's staggering, really. The growth kicked off with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, where the U.S. bought this massive section in the middle of the continent from France. That instantly doubled the country's size and secured crucial control of the Mississippi River and New Orleans. From there, Americans pushed westward rapidly into Texas in 1845, the Oregon Country in 46, and the land ceded by Mexico in 48. And they were driven by this fervent belief in manifest destiny, this idea that they were literally meant to spread all the way across the continent. Moving on to Section 2, defining the sectional divide. Let's look at how all this growth actually fractured the nation into two distinct, competing regions. So that whole concept of manifest destiny, that mission to push to the Pacific, it directly fueled sectionalism. Sectionalism is that growing tension and conflict between the North and the South. And the reason why is simple. Every single time a new territory was acquired, the immediate burning question was, will this new land be free? Or will it allow slavery? Because of this, we see two completely opposing ways of life emerge. The North was heavily investing in the market revolution, building factories and pushing for protective tariffs to support their manufacturing. The South, on the other hand, remained largely rural. They had these enormous plantations, relying heavily on the forced labor of enslaved Africans to maintain their cash crop economy. We're not just talking about different economies here. These were entirely different societies. You'll definitely want to memorize this term for your exam, states' rights, because those economic differences quickly turned intensely political. Many Southerners firmly believed in states' rights, the idea that individual states should have the ultimate power to govern themselves, without the federal government stepping in to dictate laws, especially, of course, laws regarding the institution of slavery. This deep ideological divide became a core political cause of the conflict that was coming. Which brings us to Section 3, failed compromises and crises. The fuse is lit, so let's see how the government desperately tried to stop the explosion. When you look at the history, there's this incredibly clear, tragic chain of cause and effect. You can trace a direct line from the various slavery compromises, straight through to increased sectionalism, and ultimately right to secession and the Civil War itself. Let's break down exactly what those compromises were as the government scrambled to maintain a fragile peace. In 1820, you have the Missouri Compromise, which carefully balanced the number of free and slave states to keep voting power equal in Congress. Jump ahead 30 years to the Compromise of 1850, where they tried again, adding California as a free state, but simultaneously enforcing a much stricter fugitive slave law to appease the South. But look, these attempts to keep the peace, they were just temporary bandages. They were legislative math problems that completely missed the deeper, profound moral arguments over human bondage. And well, those bandages completely ripped off in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Instead of the government deciding if a territory was free or slave, this act allowed the settlers themselves to vote on it. And the result was absolute chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups rushed into the territory, clashing violently. The area literally became known as Bleeding Kansas. This violence proved once and for all that political compromises were officially dead, and the tension was now spilling over into actual bloodshed. Section 4, a timeline to war. Let's hit the critical pressure points that lead straight into open conflict. This timeline is absolutely vital for your exam prep. We've talked about the expansion starting in 1803 and the various compromises, but let's zoom in on 1857, the Dred Scott decision. This was a catastrophic Supreme Court ruling. It declared that African Americans were not citizens, and that slaves were merely property. It even ruled that Congress had zero power to ban slavery in the territories. This decision absolutely outraged the North and basically poured gasoline on the fire right before the critical election of 1860. At the exact same time, during this whole timeline, the abolitionist movement was exploding, demanding the total end of slavery. You had brilliant minds like Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved man whose speeches and writings were just incredibly powerful. You had William Lloyd Garrison publishing the anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. Harriet Beecher Stowe helped radically change public opinion with her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which laid bare the true cruelties of the slave system. And things reached a boiling point when John Brown led an armed raid on a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in 1859. That showed people were now willing to use physical force to end slavery. Also keep in mind this era saw a rise in other reforms too, like the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention demanding women's rights, showing this broader push for equality happening in the nation. But the ultimate breaking point, that hits in 1860. Abraham Lincoln is elected president. Now, even though Lincoln stated he wouldn't abolish slavery where it already existed, he was absolutely determined to stop it from spreading. Southern states panicked. They feared his leadership would inevitably destroy their economic system and the way of life. And so they began to secede, to officially pull out of the United States. Section 5. The Civil War erupts. The time bomb finally goes off. Let's contrast the core motivations of the two sides locked in this devastating four-year conflict, starting in 1861. The Union, up north, initially went to war simply to preserve the country, just to pull those seceded states back in. The Confederacy, down south, was fighting to preserve its newfound independence and, fundamentally, to protect its institution of slavery. But everything shifts dramatically in 1863, when President Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. This was huge. It declared enslaved people in Confederate states to be free, and it officially transformed the Union's goal from just preserving the country to actively fighting a war to destroy slavery. Finally, after years of enormous destruction and massive loss of life, the Confederacy surrendered in 1865. Tragically, of course, that exact same year, President Lincoln was assassinated. Now, the story doesn't just neatly end because the shooting stops. The era immediately following the war is called Reconstruction, lasting from 1865 to 1877. The Constitution was amended. We get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to increase rights for Black Americans, but it brought massive, severe pushback. Southern states instituted disenfranchisement, using poll taxes and literacy tests to deny voting rights. This led straight into decades of legal segregation, Jim Crow laws, and the notorious 1896 Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson, which established that awful separate but equal doctrine. The wounds of this conflict would last for generations. So, I'm going to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on for your essays. Think back to the sheer scale of the expansion we talked about, the completely different economies that developed, and the utter failure of every political compromise. Was the Civil War truly inevitable once the United States began pushing westward? Understanding this profound cause and effect chain is the absolute key to mastering this era. Thanks for joining this explainer. Keep reviewing those notes, and good luck on your exam.